The stagecoach didn't so much stop as surrender. It shuddered to a halt at the edge of Ash Hollow, the way an old horse finally gives out mid-stride. Not a clean stop, not a dignified one, but the kind that rattled every bone inside and knocked a woman's hat clean sideways across her face. The driver didn't even climb down. He just hauled Marian Vale's trunk off the roof with one arm, let it drop into the dust with a sound like a body hitting the floor, and then looked out toward the flat, colorless stretch of land ahead of them, like he was already calculating how fast he could turn the horses around. "End of the line," he said. Not unkindly, just honestly. Marian straightened her hat with 2 fingers, stepped down from the coach onto ground that felt like it hadn't seen rain in 6 months, and looked around. Ash Hollow. She had heard the name exactly once, in a letter written in someone else's handwriting, because the man she was now legally married to apparently had a neighbor's boy write his correspondence for him. The letter had been 5 lines long. It told her the ranch was west of the settlement, that there were sons, 6 of them, and that she should come prepared to work. It did not say anything about the land itself. It did not mention that Ash Hollow looked less like a settlement and more like something that had tried to become a town and then thought better of it. 3 buildings. A livery that leaned hard to the left, a general store with a cracked window patched over with brown paper, and a saloon that, even at midday, had its curtains drawn like it was ashamed of itself. The wind moved through it all in one long, unbroken sigh. Marian stood with her trunk at her feet and the iron key in her coat pocket. A key that had arrived with the letter, no explanation attached. And she did what she had trained herself to do in moments of doubt. She looked for something useful. What she found was a mule tied to the post outside the general store, saddled and clearly waiting. And beside the mule, a boy of maybe 16 sitting on an upturned crate, whittling at a stick with a knife that was too big for his hands. She picked up one end of her trunk and dragged it. The boy looked up. He had a narrow face, dark eyes set wide apart, and the particular expression of someone who had been sent somewhere they didn't want to be. "You're the woman," he said. Not a question. "I'm Marian Vale," she said. "And you are?" He stared at her for a moment, like the question surprised him. "Caleb. I'm the second one." She waited. "Second oldest," he said, as if she should have understood that immediately. "Pa sent me. Said to bring the mule for your things." That was considerate of him. Caleb looked at the trunk, looked at the mule, and did not move from his crate. "It's just a mule." Marian looked at the mule, looked at the trunk, and did not wait for him. She got her hands under the leather strap and started lifting. For a woman who hadn't eaten since the morning before, she managed it with less ceremony than Caleb expected because he stood up fast and took the other end without being asked. They loaded it in silence, not comfortable silence, the kind of silence that happens when 2 people are deciding what they think of each other and neither wants to go first. He gave her a leg up onto the mule. She didn't thank him. She nodded. He understood the difference. Well, the ride to the Mercer ranch took 40 minutes on flat land that offered nothing to look at except the occasional juniper tree standing alone in the scrub like it had been left there and forgotten. The sky was enormous and pale and gave the impression of pressing down rather than opening up. Marian kept her eyes on the ground ahead and catalogued what she knew. Gideon Mercer, widower, 6 sons, cattle rancher. His wife had been dead for, the letter hadn't said how long exactly. Long enough that the household had apparently stopped functioning. That was the phrase his neighbor had used when Marian had written back asking for more information before she made her decision. The household has stopped functioning. 3 words that covered 1,000 different kinds of ruin. She had made her decision in a single afternoon. She had sat at the kitchen table of her sister's house in Danforth, Ohio, looked at the letter, looked at the key, and made a list in her head. Not of reasons to go, but of things she would be leaving behind. The list had been short, and the things on it had not been worth staying for. She was 31 years old. She had managed a boarding house for 4 years before it closed. She knew how to feed a crowd, stretch a dollar, fix a hem, and hold her tongue when it mattered. She did not know Gideon Mercer, but she knew what a family in trouble looked like, and the letter, all 5 sparse lines of it, had the particular tone of a man who had stopped knowing how to ask for help. She had packed 1 trunk. She had not cried. The ranch came into view around a low rise, and Marian's first impression was that it was bigger than she expected and more tired than she'd feared. The main house was a long, low structure of dark wood with a porch that sagged on one end and a chimney that needed repointing. Behind it, a barn that had seen better decades, a water trough, a corral with a dozen horses standing together like they were trying to keep each other warm, fence line that ran in the right direction but had gaps where posts had gone down and hadn't come back up. It was the kind of place that had once had someone taking care of it. Caleb didn't say anything as they came up the dirt track toward the house. He rode ahead slightly and kept his eyes forward, and Marian noticed that his jaw had tightened in a particular way. Not anger exactly, more like bracing, like a person approaching something they were never quite sure how to handle. The porch was empty. Good. She had not wanted an audience for the arrival. What she got instead, when Caleb pushed open the front door and stood back to let her through, was a smell. Something burning. Not wood. Food. Scorched food, which was a specific and unmistakable disaster, the kind that meant someone had put something on heat and walked away from it long enough for it to go past saving. And beneath that smell, movement. She stepped into the front room and found herself looking at a kitchen visible through an open doorway, where a boy, small, very small, couldn't have been more than 4 years old, was standing on an upturned crate in front of a cast-iron pot, holding a wooden spoon that was twice the length of his arm, stirring something with the solemn focus of someone who had been given an important job and was terrified of failing at it. The pot was smoking. The boy did not look up. "How long has that been on?" Marian asked. Caleb had the grace to look slightly ashamed. "Since noon." It was nearly 5 in the afternoon. She crossed to the kitchen in 4 steps, moved the boy gently to one side. He startled and looked up at her with enormous brown eyes. Not afraid exactly, just uncertain, the way very young children look when an unfamiliar adult enters their space. And she took the pot off the heat. The contents were beyond saving. Beans, she thought, originally. Now something closer to charcoal and salt. "What's your name?" she asked the small boy. He blinked at her. He had a smear of something, flour, maybe, across his left cheek, and his shirt was on backwards. "Samuel," he said finally, "but everyone calls me Sam." "Sam," she said. "When did you eat last?" He thought about it with the seriousness only small children apply to questions like that. "Breakfast," he said. But breakfast was only bread. Marian set the ruined pot in the wash basin and turned to look at the kitchen properly. It was not a disaster, not in the way some kitchens get. It was more like a room that had been abandoned mid-thought. Half-empty sacks of flour and cornmeal, a string of dried peppers, potatoes in a basket, 3 of them soft, but the rest still good. A side of salt pork hanging from the ceiling beam, onions, a partial wheel of hard yellow cheese. It wasn't much, but it was something. She took off her coat. She hung it on the peg by the kitchen door. She pushed up her sleeves. "Sit down somewhere you're not in my way," she told Sam, "and stay out of trouble." Sam climbed off the crate, walked to the corner of the kitchen, and sat down on the floor with his back against the wall. He pulled his knees up to his chest and watched her with those enormous eyes. From somewhere deeper in the house, she could hear voices. Older boys. The particular sound of young men talking in the low, half-aggressive register they use when they're not quite fighting, but could be. She could hear it, and she chose, for the moment, to let it stay where it was. The rest of them came in stages. The next one appeared in the kitchen doorway about 20 minutes later, drawn presumably by the smell, which had shifted from scorched ruin to something more like onions frying in a cast-iron pan with diced salt pork. He was taller than Caleb and broader across the shoulders, with the same dark Mercer eyes but a harder set to his mouth. He looked at Marian standing at the stove, looked at Sam sitting in the corner, and looked back at Marian like he was trying to determine the most efficient way to address the situation. "Who said you could use our kitchen?" he said. "Hunger generally doesn't wait for permission," Marian said, without turning around. A pause. "I'm Thomas, the oldest." "Marian Vale." She adjusted the heat under the pan. "Supper will be ready in about an hour. If you want to make yourself useful, there's water that needs hauling." Thomas didn't move for a moment. She could feel him deciding whether to be offended or practical. Practical one, apparently, because she heard him move away from the door. Whether he went for the water or just walked off to report back to his brothers, she didn't know and didn't ask. The next hour brought the others in ones and twos. They didn't introduce themselves. They stood in doorways and looked at her from the edges of rooms, the way stray cats approach something unfamiliar. She cataloged them by process of elimination. There were 6 in total, which she'd known from the letter. Thomas was the eldest, clearly maybe 19 or 20. Caleb was second, 16. Then a pair that seemed close enough in age to be almost twins. She'd learn later that they were 14 and 13, Eli and Jonah, and they moved together and spoke to each other in short, unintelligible bursts, and regarded Marian with matching expressions of deep suspicion. A boy of about 9 sat alone at the edge of the front room, doing something with a length of rope, practicing knots with methodical focus that suggested he was either trying to ignore what was happening or simply had very good powers of concentration. That was Henry. And then Sam, who had not moved from the kitchen floor and had, at some point, fallen asleep against the wall with his mouth slightly open. None of them spoke to her unless she spoke first. None of them offered to help, exactly, though Thomas did eventually haul the water without comment, and Eli, or possibly Jonah, appeared at her elbow at one point, peered into the pot of beans she'd set to soak, and asked what she was making. "Bean and pork stew," she said, "with cornbread." He stared at the pot. "Mama used to make that," he said, and then walked away before she could respond. She kept her face forward and adjusted the heat. The cornbread went into the Dutch oven at 6. The stew had been going slow for the better part of 2 hours by then, the beans coming around. The pork soft enough to fall apart when she pressed it with a spoon. She'd found a half-dozen dried chilies in the back of a shelf and added 2 of them. Not enough to be aggressive, just enough to give it depth. She'd found salt that was almost gone and rationed it carefully. She found a crock of lard and used it sparingly because she didn't know when more was coming. She had not asked anyone to set the table. She had set it herself, found the plates stacked behind a cabinet door, mismatched, chipped, 6 in one pattern and 2 in another, and laid them out for 8. 7 boys and her. Gideon Mercer had not returned from the range. She had not asked about him. Not yet. At some point, the kitchen had filled up. Not because anyone had been invited in, but because the smell had done what smell always does. Moved through walls and around corners and found the people who were hungry, which was all of them. Thomas stood against the far wall with his arms crossed. Caleb sat in a chair that he'd turned backwards and straddled. Eli and Jonah were at the table already, though they'd sat as far from each other as possible, which was a mystery she'd solve some other time. Henry had climbed onto a chair and had his rope still in his hands, working the same knot over and over. Sam had woken up and relocated himself to directly behind Marian's left knee, which was an inconvenient place to stand, but she let it go. "Table," she said, once. Not loud, just clear. They moved. Not all at once, not smoothly, not without some friction. Eli and Jonah both reached for the same chair. There was a brief contest of elbows. Thomas told them both to quit it in a voice that suggested he'd said it 10,000 times. But they moved. She lifted the Dutch oven, set the cornbread on the table wrapped in a cloth. She ladled stew into each bowl herself because the ladle only had one handle, and it was hot, and she didn't need anyone burning themselves tonight. She sat. Sam appeared beside her elbow. She moved her chair to make room for his. He had no chair. She looked around, spotted a 3-legged stool near the hearth, and Caleb got up without being asked and brought it over and set it down next to her. She nodded. He sat back down. For a moment, no one moved. 6 boys and a woman who was technically their stepmother and was about as familiar to them as the far side of the moon, all sitting around the same table with a meal between them that none of them had made, and all of them were hungry for. Thomas picked up his spoon first, looked at the stew, looked across the table at nothing in particular. "We wait for Pa," he said. "Then we wait," Marian said. So they waited. And to her credit, and she would think of this later, in the dark, as one of the things that had possibly saved the evening, she did not fill the silence with talk. She just sat, the same way she'd learned to sit with difficult things over the years, not running at them, not running from them, just there. Gideon Mercer came home at 7:10. She heard the horse first, then boots on the porch steps, then the door, which stuck in the frame and required a shoulder. She noted that, filed it away. The particular silence of a person who was tired down in their bones had a sound too, she had learned. A heaviness in the footsteps. A pause before entering a room, as if stealing. He appeared in the kitchen doorway and stopped. He was taller than she'd imagined, though she hadn't imagined much. Wide through the shoulders in a way that suggested 20 years of heavy work rather than any particular advantage of birth. Dark hair gone gray at the temples, and shorter on top than it had probably once been. A face that had been weathered and then weathered again. Not lined like a man who smiled a lot, but not cruel either. Just used. The face of someone who had been asked to carry something heavy for a long time and had done it without setting it down. He looked at his sons, seated. He looked at the table, the food, the set places, the cornbread already half consumed by Jonah, who had apparently not been able to wait any longer and was eating with his eyes down like he was hoping no one would notice. He looked at Marian. She did not stand up. She had thought about it and decided against it. Standing up would have made it a greeting between strangers. She was already seated at his table. She let that be its own statement. "You made it," he said. His voice was low, rougher than she'd expected, like it didn't get used much. "I did," she said. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the one she'd deliberately left open, and sat down. He looked at the bowl in front of him. He picked up the spoon. He tasted it. The room was very quiet. He tasted it again. He set the spoon down and looked at the table for a moment. Not at her, not at the boys, just at the grain of the wood, and something moved across his face that was hard to name. Not surprise exactly. More like recognition, like tasting something he'd stopped expecting to taste again. "That's good," he said, quietly, like it cost him something to say. Nobody said anything. Then Eli, or Jonah, pushed the cornbread toward the middle of the table so Gideon could reach it. And at the far end of the table, Thomas, who had not said a word since Gideon came in, reached over and without looking at Marian, without ceremony or explanation, pushed the empty chair beside him away from the table slightly. Making room. It was not a welcome. Not exactly. It was something smaller and more complicated than that. But it was something. Marian reached for her own spoon and ate her supper. Outside, the wind moved through Ash Hollow in that same long, unbroken sigh. But inside, for the first time in what the house seemed like a very long time, the sound of people eating together filled the space from wall to wall. Sam leaned against her arm. She let him. The dishes didn't wash themselves. Marian had half expected, not hoped, just half expected, in the way you expect things when you don't know people yet, that someone might offer, that the meal having gone reasonably well might translate into some small gesture of cooperation. A boy picking up a plate, someone carrying the pot to the wash basin, anything. What she got instead was the sound of chairs scraping back and boots on floorboards as 6 boys dissolved into the rest of the house like smoke through a cracked window. Thomas went first, out the front door without a word, and the others followed in their various directions. Eli and Jonah up the stairs, Henry back to his rope and his corner, Caleb to wherever Caleb went when he wanted to disappear. Sam, who had eaten half a bowl of stew and fallen asleep against Marian's arm, somewhere between the second and third helping of cornbread, had to be carried. She'd looked around for someone to do it. Nobody was left. She carried him herself. He was heavier than he looked, the way sleeping children always are. And she didn't know which room was his. She stood in the hallway at the bottom of the stairs with Sam's head on her shoulder and looked up into the dark of the upper floor. "Second door," said a voice. She turned. Gideon was still at the table, the way she hadn't noticed because she'd been looking everywhere else. He had a cup of something, coffee or what passed for it, and he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not warm, not unwelcoming either, just watching. "Second door on the left," he said again. She went up. The stairs creaked on the 3rd and 5th steps. The second door on the left opened into a small room with 2 narrow beds, one of which was clearly Sam's. It had a knitted blanket half on the floor and a wooden horse tucked against the pillow. She laid him down and pulled the blanket up, and that was that. She did not linger. She did not look around at the room for too long, because it would tell her things about the life lived in it, and she wasn't ready for all of that yet. When she came back downstairs, Gideon had moved to the front porch. She washed the dishes alone. It took the better part of an hour. The pot had to be scraped and soaked and scraped again. She found a lamp that needed trimming and trimmed it. She found a cloth that was past saving and used it anyway until it fell apart in her hands. She worked through the quiet of the house, through the sounds of boys settling upstairs. A door closing, something heavy dropped on a floor, low voices she couldn't make out the words of, and she did not think about whether this had been a mistake. She had learned a long time before Ash Hollow that thinking about whether something was a mistake while you were already in it didn't help anything. You just kept working. The fire had burned low by the time she was done. She banked it, found a candle, and went to find where Gideon had gone. He was on the porch with his back to the door, forearms on the railing, looking out at the dark of the range. The sky was the kind of clear you only got this far from any real town. Stars not just present, but pressing, dense and indifferent. The cold had come in hard after sundown. She pulled her coat tighter and stood in the doorway for a moment. "I'll make a list in the morning," she said. "Provisions that are running low. If you can tell me when someone goes into the settlement next, I can send it along." He didn't turn around. "Thomas goes Saturdays." "Saturday, then." A pause. The kind that wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but had weight to it. "You didn't have to do the dishes," he said. "Someone did." He turned at that. Not all the way, just enough to look at her sideways. In the dark, his face was harder to read. "You're not what I expected," he said. "I didn't know what to expect either," she said. "I still don't." That seemed to settle something in him, or at least not unsettle it further. He turned back to the range. "Boys will be up before dawn," he said. "The two oldest work the cattle. The middle two handle the horses and the fencing. Henry does what he can, which is more than people think. Sam—" He stopped, started again. "Sam doesn't have a task yet. He just follows whoever will let him." "Who lets him?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Nobody much. He slows things down." Marian thought about the small boy standing on a crate, stirring a pot of scorched beans with a spoon he could barely lift, left there to do a job nobody had really thought through. She kept her voice even. "He's 4. I know how old he is." She didn't push it. "Not tonight." "I'll take the room at the end of the hall," she said. "I have a key for it." That did something. He turned fully then and looked at her with something that was either surprise or discomfort, possibly both. "That was Clara's room," he said. "Clara. So that was her name. The letter hadn't said. I had it locked after—" He didn't finish the sentence, pressed his jaw shut around the end of it. "I know," Marian said, though she hadn't known until this exact moment. "If there's somewhere else more appropriate, I'll take that." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the wind came through and moved the dry grass at the edge of the porch, and passed on. "No," he said finally. "It's the right room. Take it." She nodded. She went back inside. She did not ask any more questions that night. The first full day was an education. She was up before the light fully arrived, which meant she was up before most of the boys, which was the point. She'd slept in Clara's room on a narrow bed with her own blanket from the trunk, in a room she hadn't let herself look at properly in the dark. In the morning light, with the curtains she'd kept closed overnight, still closed, she'd dressed and gone straight to the kitchen without looking at the walls or the chest of drawers or the small framed sketch above the headboard that she'd noticed only as a shape in the dark and chosen not to examine. The kitchen was cold. The fire had gone completely out overnight, which meant someone should have banked it better, which meant her, since she'd been the last one up. She restarted it with the method she'd been using since she was 12 years old, crumpled paper and dry tinder and patience, and by the time she had oats going and water heating for coffee, the sky outside the kitchen window had gone from black to deep blue to the particular pale gray that came just before actual morning. Thomas appeared first, same as the night before, in the kitchen doorway with his boots already on. He looked at her, looked at the stove, looked at his own hands. "You're up," he said. "So are you." She poured him a cup of the coffee. It was weak. She'd found only a small amount left in the tin, and she'd have to add it to the Saturday list. She set the cup on the counter because she wasn't sure if handing it to him directly would be welcome. He picked it up, drank from it, made a face. "That's weak." "There's not much left," she said. I'll note it down. Pa likes it stronger." "I'm sure he does. Pour it back if you'd rather have nothing." He didn't pour it back. He leaned against the counter and drank it with the expression of someone who had decided to be ungrateful about something and then lost the energy for it halfway through. He was 19, she'd worked out, possibly 20. Old enough to be tired in the way that only came from real responsibility, young enough that the tiredness hadn't settled into something permanent yet. "How long have you been running things?" she asked, keeping her voice conversational, like it was just a question, not a doorway. He glanced at her sideways. "Since Ma died." "How long is that?" 3 years. He said it flatly, like a fact about weather. Thomas was 17 when she went. Pa couldn't do much for a while. So. Such a small word for such a heavy thing. "You've done well," she said. He snorted, not mean, just disbelieving. "The place is half falling apart. The place is standing, 6 boys are fed and alive. That's not nothing." He looked at her then. Really looked. Not the sideways suspicious glance he'd been using since she arrived, but directly, like he was recalculating something. She held his gaze and kept her face neutral, because she wasn't trying to win anything. She was just telling him what she could see. He finished the coffee, set the cup down, and went out through the back door. She heard him call for Caleb somewhere outside. She turned back to the oats. She met the resistance more squarely on the second morning. It came from Eli, who was 14 and the sharper-tongued of the 2 middle boys. She had been on the ranch a full day and change, which was apparently long enough for the novelty of edible food to wear thin and for the underlying question to surface. What exactly does she think she's doing here? She was reorganizing the kitchen shelves, not dramatically, just functionally, moving things to places where they could be found again without a 20-minute search. When Eli appeared in the kitchen and watched her move a sack of cornmeal to a higher shelf, with the expression of someone watching someone else rearrange their belongings without permission. "That was fine where it was," he said. "It was on the floor getting damp," she said. "Up here it stays dry." "It's always been on the floor." "Things can change." He pulled out a chair and dropped into it, not to help, just to be present in the way teenagers were present when they wanted to make their skepticism felt as an atmospheric condition. "Thomas says you're staying," he said. "I'm staying." He didn't sound happy about it. He doesn't have to be happy about it. Eli picked at a groove in the table with his thumbnail. He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him working up to something. "Our ma was a good cook," he said. Not to compliment her, more like drawing a line. "I'm sure she was." "Better than that stew last night." She moved the dried peppers to a hook where she could reach them easily. "Maybe," she said. That seemed to surprise him. He'd expected a defense, probably, or an apology. She gave him neither. She just kept moving things around. "Jonah said it was good," he admitted, after a pause that was longer than he intended. "Jonah should speak for himself then." Eli's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent to one. "He does that," he said. "He talks too much." "And you talk too little?" "I talk exactly the right amount." She looked at him over her shoulder. "That's what people who talk too little always think." He stared at her. She turned back to the shelves, and after another moment, without being asked, he got up and moved the bench that had been blocking the corner cabinet so she could get to it. She didn't thank him. He didn't want thanks. He wanted to feel like it was his decision, so she let it be his decision. Well, Henry was different. Henry was 9 years old and watched everything with wide, careful eyes. And the first time she caught him watching her, he didn't look away the way she expected. He held her gaze with a directness unusual for his age, like he was making an assessment he'd started before she arrived and hadn't finished yet. She found him one afternoon sitting on the porch steps with his rope, still working that same knot, though she could see from the way he did it that he already knew it perfectly and had been practicing some other reason. The same way some people cleaned already clean surfaces when they needed to think. She sat down on the step beside him. Not too close. She had a mending basket with her. There was always mending. And she worked on one of Sam's shirts with the needle and thread. He watched her hands. She watched his. "That's a bowline," she said after a while. He looked up fast. "You know knots?" "My uncle ran a feed depot. Had to tie down loads. He taught me." She tied off the thread. "He said a bowline was the one knot that could save your life and wouldn't jam when you needed to undo it fast." Henry looked at his rope with renewed interest, like this information had just added value to something he already cared about. "Pa says I should be learning something more useful," he said. What does Pa say would be more useful? Cattle work. But I'm too small still. He said it without resentment, just factually. Eli says I'm the spare. Marian stopped sewing. She looked at him. The spare what? Henry shrugged, one of those small shrugs that wasn't quite indifferent. The spare son, like a spare part. The ranch doesn't need 7 of us. It only needs the big ones. I just haven't grown yet. She looked at him for a moment. 9 years old, and already someone had said something like that within his hearing. Whether they meant it cruelly or carelessly hardly mattered once the words were in a child's head. Eli's 14, she said, going back to her sewing, keeping her voice even. 14-year-olds say things they think sound smart that are actually just stupid. Don't organize your life around what Eli says. Henry blinked. Then he looked down at his rope. After a moment, he held it out to her. Do you want to learn a different one? She took it. Show me. The tension with Caleb was harder to locate because Caleb was harder to locate. He was the ghost of the ranch, technically present, perpetually elsewhere, appearing at meals and then vanishing, doing his assigned work and then disappearing into some corner of the land that nobody thought to follow him to. He wasn't sullen, exactly. He just kept himself narrow, like he'd learned to take up as little space as possible and had gotten good at it. She found him 2 days in, sitting in the barn with a book. She'd come in to check on a sack of feed she'd noticed was spilling, and there he was in the back corner on an upturned bucket, so deep in what he was reading that he didn't hear her come in until she was almost beside him. He looked up and closed the book in the same motion, not like he was hiding it, more like a reflex. Don't stop on my account, she said. He looked at her, at the book. It's nothing. She could see the spine from where she stood. It was a history, something about the Mexican territories. Doesn't look like nothing, she said. He didn't respond. He set it on his knee like he wasn't sure whether to open it again. Thomas says reading's a waste of time when there's work, he said. Thomas works too hard to have opinions about everything. Caleb's eyebrows moved, just slightly. You don't know Thomas. Not yet. She checked the feed sack, found the tear, and pressed the split edges together to see how bad it was. Not too bad. She could sew it. I know that anybody who spends time alone with a book usually has reasons for it. The silence that followed was the specific kind of silence that meant she'd touched something real, and he wasn't sure what to do about it. She didn't press. She folded the feed sack, tucked it under her arm to deal with later, and turned to go. She used to read to us, Caleb said. Behind her, low enough that she almost didn't catch it. Ma did, in the evenings. She stopped. She didn't turn around. She understood in that moment that turning around would make it too much, would turn a confession into a conversation he hadn't decided to have. That's a good thing to remember, she said, to the barn door in front of her. She heard him open the book again. She walked out into the late afternoon sun and let the moment stay where it belonged. Gideon was the hardest. Not because he was unkind. He wasn't unkind. He was something more difficult than unkind, in the way a stone wall is more difficult than a locked door. At least with a locked door, you can see the lock. He worked from before first light until well after dark most days, appeared for meals, answered direct questions with the minimum number of words required, and otherwise maintained a careful distance that seemed less about her specifically and more about everything in general. Like he'd drawn a perimeter around himself at some point and could no longer remember where he'd put the gate. She watched him with his sons. Not obviously, not the way a person watches when they want the watch to know it, but in the quiet way you observe anything you're trying to understand. He wasn't absent exactly. He checked in on the work, gave Thomas and Caleb instructions each morning, corrected Eli once about the way he was handling a fence post. With Henry, he was gruff in a way she suspected he thought was brisk and useful. With Sam, he was complicated. She could see it. The way he looked at the small boy sometimes, this mixture of love and something like pain that he'd buried so deep he probably didn't know it still showed. On the third night, she was up late. She'd found a broken hinge on the back door that kept the door from closing properly, and she was trying to fix it herself with a screwdriver she'd found in the bottom of a kitchen drawer. And Gideon came in from the porch and found her on her knees by the door. He stopped. The hinge is cracked, she said, not looking up. The top one. I can brace it, but it needs replacing properly. I'll deal with it. I'm already here. He stood there a moment, and she could feel him weighing something. Then he went to the shed off the back of the house and came back with a spare hinge. He didn't tell her to move. He just crouched down beside her, and they fixed the hinge together in the pool of lamplight from the kitchen, him doing the heavier part with the screws, her holding the door in position so it lined up straight. Neither of them said much. At one point, their hands touched on the door frame when she adjusted her grip, and he pulled his away without comment, and she pretended not to notice. When it was done, he stood. She stood. He tested the door twice, and it closed cleanly. "Thank you," he said, quietly. "You'd have gotten to it," she said. "Maybe," he said. "Probably not soon." It wasn't much, but it was honest, and she appreciated honest more than she appreciated anything smooth. She picked up the lamp. "Sleep well?" she said. She went down the hall to Clara's room and closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a while. She had been in this house 3 days. She had slept in another woman's room, cooked from another woman's kitchen, carefully navigated 6 sons who had loved another woman and lost her, and still carried the shape of that loss in everything they did. The oldest one running himself down trying to fill a role too big for him. The second one hiding in books. 2 middle ones who fought with each other because fighting was easier than feeling. A 9-year-old who'd been told he was a spare part. A 4-year-old standing on a crate stirring scorched beans because no one had thought to tell him that wasn't his job. And a man on the other side of the house who had presumably once been something other than this quiet, controlled, perimeter-drawing version of himself, and who had spent 3 years becoming very good at surviving without letting anything in. She was not going to fix any of this quickly. She had known that before she came, and she knew it more clearly now. She lay down on the bed, still in her clothes, and looked at the ceiling in the dark. Outside, the wind moved through Ash Hollow. Inside, the back door held against it. It was, she thought, a start. The first week passed the way first weeks in difficult places always do. Not smoothly, not badly, but in that grinding, uncertain middle ground where nothing is quite right and nothing is quite wrong enough to force a decision. Marian learned the rhythms of the ranch the way she learned most things, by watching first, then moving when she understood where the gaps were. The mornings belonged to Thomas and Caleb, who were out before full light with Gideon and didn't come back until midday, aching and short-tempered, at which point food was the only thing that mattered, and conversation was not attempted. The afternoons were more complicated. Eli and Jonah worked the horses and the fence line, which kept them busy enough not to be underfoot, but they overlapped in the evenings in ways that generated a specific friction she hadn't quite mapped yet. Henry did his work and then disappeared into whatever private project occupied him that day. Rope or rocks or some intricate thing he was building in pieces behind the barn that she'd caught a glimpse of but hadn't asked about yet. Sam followed the household like a small satellite, orbiting whoever was nearest and most likely to tolerate company. She made the house functional. Not beautiful, not transformed, just functional. She fixed 3 things that had been broken long enough to become invisible. The hinge she and Gideon had addressed together, a chair whose leg had been propped up with a folded piece of leather for so long the leather had compressed into the shape of the floor, and a window pane in the back room that someone had covered with a board when it cracked and left that way, which meant the back room was permanently dark and cold, and no one used it. She replaced the glass with a piece she'd found wrapped in cloth in the shed, and afterward the room got afternoon light for the first time in what appeared to be months. Nobody commented on any of it. She hadn't done it for comments. The cooking, though. The cooking was where she felt the ground shift in ways she could almost measure. It wasn't dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was Jonah, on the 4th morning, appearing in the kitchen doorway at a time he had no practical reason to be there and asking, with elaborate casualness, what was for supper. It was Eli eating seconds on the 5th night, and then pushing his chair back hard and announcing he was going to bed like someone who resented being caught enjoying something. It was Thomas, whose default position at the table was arms crossed and expression calibrated to reveal nothing, who nonetheless always finished everything on his plate, and once, when she'd made a rye bread from a recipe she'd adapted out of necessity and habit, had looked at the loaf for a long moment before cutting a piece and said, almost to himself, "Didn't think rye grew right out here." Yes. She had explained that it didn't, she'd substituted and adjusted, and he had listened in the way people listen when they're deciding whether to be interested, and then cut a second slice. She was building something. She didn't have a word for it. It wasn't trust, not yet. more like a provisional truce between the house and the idea of her. And then the Saturday came. She had been on the Mercer ranch for 8 days when she put together her first proper list for the settlement. Coffee, the primary urgency. Flour, which was running lower faster than expected because she'd been baking more than they'd been budgeted for previously, though nobody had complained about that. Salt, lard, a bolt of cotton cloth, because Sam had 2 shirts and one of them had a tear she'd mended 3 times already. And Henry's boots had a separation in the sole she'd been watching with concern. She'd written it out the night before and added a note at the bottom, in her careful hand, that these were necessities and not improvements. She gave the list to Thomas at breakfast. He read it, looked up, looked back at it. Cotton cloth, he said. Sam needs a shirt. Henry's boots need attention. I know what Sam needs? Then you know why it's on the list. He folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. Caleb was already by the door with the wagon hitched and waiting, because Saturdays were market days and Thomas was always in and out of the settlement in under 2 hours, which was a system that apparently worked for everyone. Marian had one more thing. She'd been thinking about whether to say it, and had decided it was more useful to say it plainly than to let it sit. The coffee tin, she said, as Thomas was heading for the door. There's something at the bottom of it, wrapped in cloth. He stopped. His back was to her. I don't know if that's been there a long time or a short time, she said. It's not my business, but if it belongs to one of the boys, or to you, you should have it back before the tin gets replaced. Thomas turned slowly. His face was doing the thing it did when something had gotten through his guard, and he didn't want anyone to know. How long have you known it was there? Since the first day. And you didn't take it. She looked at him steadily. Why would I take it? He held her gaze for a moment. Then he went to the coffee tin himself. She had replenished it from a small supply she'd had in her trunk, just enough to get through until Saturday. And he reached into the near-empty original tin and took out the cloth-wrapped thing. Whatever it was small and fit in his closed hand. He looked at it. He didn't open it in front of her. It's Ma's ring, he said. She had 2 of them. Pa has one. I kept the other one so nobody lost it. She nodded. That was smart. He put it in his shirt pocket with the list. I'll get the cloth, he said, and left. The day Thomas and Caleb went to the settlement was the day the trouble finally broke the surface. It had been building, she'd known that. She knew how these things worked in households under pressure. The real conflicts didn't announce themselves. They gathered in corners and collected weight until something small and unrelated knocked them loose. What knocked it loose was a bucket of water. Eli had carried it from the well and set it on the kitchen counter to be used for washing. Jonah, coming through too fast the way he always did, caught it with his elbow and knocked it to the floor. The water went everywhere. Across the clean floor she'd swept, over the corner where Sam was sitting with a wooden block, and onto Eli's boots. The language Eli used was inventive and immediate and far beyond what a 14-year-old should have known. Jonah told him he should watch where he left things. Eli told him he should watch where he put his arms. Jonah, who was 13 and approximately 40% pure impulse, shoved Eli. And Eli, who had been holding on to something much larger than a bucket of water for a great deal longer than 8 days, shoved him back with a force that sent Jonah into the cabinet hard enough to shake the dishes on the shelves. The cabinet door swung open and a ceramic bowl. Old, patterned, the kind of thing that had probably been bought in a previous life with a different feeling about the future, fell off the shelf and hit the floor and broke. The noise it made was the kind that emptied a house. Sam scrambled to the far corner. Henry appeared in the doorway from the hall, took one look, and pressed himself to the wall. Marian had been coming from the back room with an armload of mending, and she stopped in the kitchen doorway and assessed. Eli was looking at the pieces of the bowl on the floor. His chest was heaving. His jaw was tight. The particular look on his face was one she recognized. Not guilt exactly, but the sick weight of having broken something that couldn't be unbroken, something that wasn't really about the bowl. Jonah was pressed against the cabinet, holding his shoulder. He wasn't crying. He was too angry to cry, which in a 13-year-old meant tears were about 30 seconds from arriving whether he wanted them or not. She set the mending down. She walked into the kitchen. She crouched down and started picking up the pieces of the bowl. Nobody moved for a moment. Henry, she said, without looking up, there's a dustpan on the peg by the back door. Henry retrieved it. She held it while he swept the small fragments into it. She was aware of Eli standing a few feet away, vibrating with something he didn't have words for. "It was Ma's," Eli said. His voice came out strange, flat and raw at the same time. That bowl was hers. She looked up at him from where she was crouching. His eyes were bright, and he looked furious and very young. "I know," she said. "You don't know anything." Not aggressive, almost helpless. "You're right," she said. "I don't know your mother. I don't know what things were like before. I know that bowl mattered, and it's broken, and that's not nothing." Jonah's jaw was trembling. "It was an accident," he said to Eli, "not to her." The apology was awkward and unformed, the way apologies were when they came from a person who was still more angry than sorry. "I know it was an accident," Eli said. But knowing a thing and feeling a thing were not the same, and Eli walked out the back door and let it close behind him, and Marian let him go. She stood up with the dustpan and looked at Jonah. His eyes were wet and he was staring at the door. "He's not really angry at you," she said. "I know," Jonah said. He wiped his eye with the back of his hand in one fast motion, like he wanted to deny it had happened. "He's never just angry at the thing that's actually there." She looked at this 13-year-old boy who had just said something startlingly perceptive and who had no idea he'd said it. "You understand him pretty well," she said. Jonah shrugged. "We share a room. It's hard not to." She carried the broken bowl pieces outside and put them in the ash pile, which felt like a better end than the rubbish. Then she went and found Eli sitting on the fence rail at the far edge of the corral, looking at nothing, doing the specific nothing of someone who needed to be left alone but not too alone. She stood at the fence rail beside him, not touching it, just present. After a while, he said, "She used to keep dried lavender in that bowl, from back east, before they came out here. She brought seeds with her." He was picking at the wood grain on the rail. "Nobody grows lavender out here." "I know," she said. "You keep saying that." Not accusatory, just noting it. "Because I do know that things matter, even things that seem small." She looked out at the range, which was the same pale, hard-scrabble distance it always was. "I'm not trying to replace anything. I want you to know that." He was quiet. "I'm not her," Marian said. "I'm not trying to be. I'm just a person who is going to be living in your house and trying not to make things worse." Eli looked at his hands on the rail. "Thomas says you're doing all right," he said, eventually, in a voice that made it clear this was a significant concession. "Thomas has been doing an impossible job for 3 years," she said. "His opinion means something." "He doesn't think so." "I know." This time, Eli actually made a sound that was adjacent to a laugh. Just barely, gone as soon as it arrived. "You gonna fix everything?" he asked. Skeptical, genuine. "No," she said, "but I can fix supper, that's something." He looked at her sideways for a long moment. Then he got off the fence rail and walked back toward the barn, and he didn't slam anything on the way, which she counted. Mercer. The crisis arrived on a Thursday, in the middle of the second week, from a direction she hadn't anticipated. She had gone to the settlement herself. She needed to see the store, see what was available and at what price, get a sense of what the household's relationship was with credit and account. Thomas had not offered to take her, and she hadn't asked him. She'd simply hitched the mule herself on a morning when Gideon had taken the older boys with him to move cattle north, and the younger boys were occupied, and she'd gone alone. The store was run by a man named Aldous, who was 50 and had the particular face of someone who had seen enough of life to have stopped expecting surprises and had been wrong about that enough times not to be smug about it. He looked at her over the counter when she came in, and she saw the recognition move across his face. The new Mercer wife. People would have talked about her. That was simply how small settlements worked. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, testing it. "Marian Vale," she said, because she hadn't settled on what she was yet. "I'm here to go over the account." He looked at her. He looked at something under his counter. Then he said carefully, "The Mercer account." "Yes." He pulled out the ledger and put it on the counter between them. She looked at the balance at the bottom of the page. She had been prepared for it to not be good. She had not been quite prepared for how not good it was. 3 years of a household buying on credit and paying it down in slow, irregular installments when cattle sold, which, she gathered from the figures, hadn't been often enough. She stood at Aldis's counter and looked at the number and did the calculation she'd been doing in the back of her mind since she arrived. The one about what the ranch was spending versus what it was likely bringing in, and understood now why the coffee tin had been so close to empty, why the salt was rationed, why there were only 2 shirts for a 4-year-old. "Gideon knows?" she asked. "He knows," Aldis said simply. She thought about a man carrying that on top of everything else. 3 years of it. And never, not once in 8 days, saying a word to her about it. Not that she'd asked, but she hadn't known to ask. She thanked Aldis. She rode the mule back to the ranch with the account balance sitting in her chest like a stone. That evening, she made the best meal she'd made since arriving. It was not a strategy exactly. Or it was, but not a calculated one. More the instinct of a person who didn't know how to address a problem with words yet, but knew exactly how to address it with work. She used the last of a cured ham she'd been conserving. She made a proper pot of beans with the dried chilies and a crust of stale bread fried in lard until it was crisp, which she crumbled over the top. She made a potato hash with the good onions. She made a rice pudding from the small cache of sugar she'd found in the back of a shelf. Thin on sugar, but thick on rice, finished with a handful of dried apple that she'd been saving since her trunk, and that smelled, when they cooked, like something from a completely different world. She cooked through the afternoon. Sam sat on his stool in the corner and watched her with enormous eyes. Henry came in at some point and sat at the table without explanation, elbows on the wood, watching the kitchen fill with smell. Even Jonah, who had been maintaining a studied distance since the bucket incident, materialized in the doorway and stood there with his arms at his sides like a person who had walked somewhere without intending to. She put it all on this table at 6. 8 plates. Every seat. They came in the way they always did, in their various states of dirty and tired, and they sat down, and there was a moment, before anyone touched anything, where she felt the room do something. Just a small thing. A settling. Like a sound that had been going on so long you didn't hear it anymore. And then it stopped. Gideon sat at the head of the table. He looked at the meal laid out in front of him. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they've been a long time without and have stopped expecting. Then he looked at Marian at the far end of the table. She was watching Sam, who had climbed onto his stool and was already reaching for the bread with the concentration of someone who had priorities. "Sam," she said. "Wait." He pulled his hand back, looked at her, looked at his father. Gideon said grace, not because anyone expected it or asked, just the 3 quiet words he always said, the same ones every night, brief enough that she'd thought at first it was just a habit of breath. Then he picked up his fork. He ate the ham first, then the beans. She watched him, not obviously, from under her attention on her own plate. He put his fork down. He said nothing for a moment. The table had its sounds. The clatter of metal on ceramic, Jonah telling Eli something in a low voice, Henry's particular focused silence. Sam had gotten his bread and was eating it with the systematic dedication of someone who intended to survive winter. "Marian." She looked up. Gideon looked back at her from the other end of the table with an expression she had not seen from him before, not soft, not demonstrative. This was not a man given to demonstrations, but something had moved in it, something that had been very still for a long time. "This is the finest food I've had in years," he said, quietly enough that it was almost private, though the table was right there, 8 people on it, everyone capable of hearing. The table went a little quieter. She felt it without looking around. "I went long on the rice pudding," she said. "The sugar's almost gone." "It doesn't need more sugar," he said. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at her plate. Her heart was doing something she didn't fully want to examine, something that had less to do with the compliment and more to do with a man who had learned to keep everything inside, finally letting one small thing out. It was Thomas who moved first. She caught it from the corner of her eye. He reached over and shifted the empty chair beside him, the one that had been pushed slightly too far from the table, and straightened it, made room for it. It was a small motion, barely worth noting. He didn't look at her when he did it, but Caleb saw, and Jonah saw. And Henry, who saw everything, went back to his potato hash with something that might have been a small, private smile. The meal went on. The lamp burned. Outside, the sky went from dark blue to full black, and the range settled into its nighttime quiet. Inside the Mercer house, the sounds of people eating together at the same table filled the room from wall to wall. It was not peace. She knew better than to call it that, but it was the closest thing to it that had lived inside these walls in a very long time. And the chair that Thomas had straightened stayed where he'd put it, in line with all the others, like it had always been there. The rice pudding was gone by the time the table cleared, scraped clean in a way that said more than any words would have. Even Eli, who had spent the better part of 2 weeks maintaining a careful ambivalence about everything Marian cooked, had eaten his portion and then looked at the empty bowl with the expression of a person who wanted to ask for more, and had decided that wanting it was concession enough. The boys went to bed earlier than usual that night, not because anyone told them to, more the way a room empties after something significant has happened. People drifting away in ones and twos as if they need space to process what they can't quite name. Thomas went first, which set the permission for the others. Caleb followed. Eli and Jonah went upstairs together, which was not always the case, and she heard their voices through the ceiling, low, no friction in them, while she cleared the table. Henry fell asleep in his chair, genuinely, his head tipped sideways and his rope still in his hands. The knot he'd been working on pulled halfway through before sleep took him. She covered him with a blanket she found on the back of the settle and left the lamp turned very low. Sam she carried up herself. He'd made it longer than usual, buoyed by the rice pudding and the general shift in the room's atmosphere, but gravity had won eventually, and he'd been asleep against the table's edge with his cheek on his forearm for the last 20 minutes of the meal. He barely stirred when she lifted him. She put him in his bed, tucked the knitted blanket up, and set the wooden horse back where it belonged against his pillow. When she came back downstairs, Gideon was still at the table. He had a cup of coffee, proper coffee now, the good tin Thomas had brought back from Saturday, and he was looking at the table surface in front of him the way he sometimes did, like the grain of the wood had something to tell him if he waited long enough. The lamp above the table made the room feel smaller than it was. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it moving against the eaves. She sat down, not at the far end, where she usually sat, but closer, 2 seats away, because the table was long and there was no reason to conduct a conversation across 8 feet of space. He looked up. "I went to see Aldous," she said. "Last week. I didn't mention it." Something moved across his face. A tightening, quick and controlled. "I know, he told me." He set down the cup. "You should have asked me before going through the account." "You're right," she said. "I should have. I wanted to understand the full picture before I said anything. And now you understand it. Some of it." He looked at her steadily. Whatever he was feeling about this, exposed, defensive, something else, he kept it level. It was a particular skill he had, she'd noticed, the ability to keep things level long past the point where most people would have let something show. She didn't know yet whether that was strength or damage. Probably both. "The debt isn't new," he said. "I know what it is. I've been managing it." "I know you have." "Then what is it you want to say?" She thought about how to do this. She'd been thinking about it since she rode back from Aldous' store with that number sitting in her chest. She wasn't here to indict anyone. She wasn't here to offer solutions she'd invented on the back of 2 weeks' knowledge to a problem that had been building for 3 years. But she also wasn't the kind of person who could see a thing clearly and then pretend she hadn't. "I want to understand what you need," she said. "Not just the house, the ranch, the whole of it, what it takes to keep it running and what's been falling short." He was quiet for a moment. Why? The question was genuine, not hostile, just genuinely asking what she meant by need and what she intended to do with the answer. She understood that. Someone had given him 5 lines in a letter and sent a stranger to his door, and so far that stranger had washed his dishes and cooked his meals and fixed his hinge and left most of the larger questions carefully alone. He was probably waiting for the part where she told him what she actually wanted. "Because I'm here," she said, "and being here means I'm part of it now, whether that's convenient or not. And I'd rather understand the thing I'm part of than work around it in the dark." He sat with that for a moment. Then he got up and went to the desk in the corner of the front room. A roll top that was always closed. She had not gone near it, and he opened it and came back with a ledger. Not Aldous', his own. He put it on the table between them and sat back down. She opened it. She read through it without saying anything, turning pages carefully, understanding as she went. The cattle numbers. The cost of feed through the bad winters, the price per head at the last 3 sales, and what that had netted against what the debt required. The wages he owed 2 ranch hands he'd had to let go the previous spring because there wasn't enough to pay them, which meant Thomas and Caleb were now doing the work of 4 grown men between them. The mortgage on the land itself, something she hadn't known about until now, which had 2 years left on its term at a rate that made the math difficult under any circumstances and nearly impossible under current ones. She closed the ledger. "The herd's the issue," she said. "The herd's small," he said. "Lost 20 head to the fever 2 winters ago. Before that, a bad crossing. Lost the better part of a drive in the river. I've been rebuilding, but it takes time, and we haven't had time. And the hands you let go, I can't take them back on what the cattle are bringing." He said it without apology, just fact. Thomas knows how to work cattle. Caleb's learning, but they're young, and there's only 2 of them for what should be a 4-man operation. She thought about Thomas's face at breakfast every morning, that particular exhaustion that sat too deep for a 19-year-old. Does Thomas know the full picture, she asked? The mortgage, the account? No. He thinks he does. He thinks he knows enough. Gideon's jaw tightened slightly. He doesn't need to be carrying that. He's already carrying it, she said. He just doesn't know the shape of it. That's worse, not better. Gideon looked at her. She expected resistance. What she got was a silence that felt less like refusal and more like someone who had been told something they'd suspected and weren't sure what to do with it. "He's 19, Gideon said, quietly. "I know," she said. "You were probably working a full man's job at 19. That's different." "Is it?" He didn't answer that. He picked up his coffee and drank from it and looked at the table again. The wind outside moved in a long push against the house and then died back. "Why did you come?" he said, eventually. Not the administrative version of the question. Not why did you agree to the marriage? What were your practical reasons? The real version, the one that had been sitting under the surface of these 2 weeks. She had thought about this too. Not what she would say. She hadn't prepared an answer. But the question itself, which she'd known was coming eventually. "Because something needed doing," she said. He looked up. "I was in Danforth," she said, "managing a boarding house that had been sold out from under the previous owner, which meant it was going to close, which meant I had a job for another 3 months and then nothing lined up. My sister's house has 4 people in it already and room for maybe 2. She folded her hands on the table. "I'm not telling you this so you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you so you understand that I didn't come here chasing something I wanted. And I didn't come here out of desperation either. I came because the letter said there was a family in trouble and work that needed doing, and that's something I know how to walk toward." He listened to this with his hands around the coffee cup and his eyes on her, and she had the sense he was hearing not just the words, but the shape of the life behind them, the same way she'd been reading the shape of his. "You didn't know me," he said. "No." "Didn't know the boys?" "No." "Didn't know this place?" "Still don't," she said. "Not really. 2 weeks isn't knowing a place." He almost smiled. Not quite. Something in the region of it. "Most people who came out here knowing what it was turned around," he said. "We're not easy. I've noticed." "Eli giving you trouble?" "Eli's grieving," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her for a moment with something that shifted the quality of the silence between them. Like she'd said something that moved a piece he hadn't expected to move. "Claire used to say that," he said, "that grief and trouble weren't the same thing." She didn't respond right away. She let the name sit in the room where he'd put it. He'd said it, Clara, without prompting, without it being extracted from him. And she understood that was not a small thing for a man who hadn't said it in front of her once in 2 weeks. "She sounds like she knew her own mind," Marian said. "She did." He turned to the coffee cup in his hands. "She was better at this than I am. The house, the boys. She had a way of making things manageable. When she died, I thought I could keep it the same, keep everything the same." He stopped. His voice had gone to a register that was careful and controlled and cost him something. "It didn't stay the same. Things don't." "No." He looked at the middle distance. "Thomas grew up faster than he should have. The little ones, Sam doesn't remember her at all. He was 1 year old when she went. He knows her from what the boys tell him. And what the boys tell him is whatever they can stand to say on a given day, which means some days he knows more than others. Something about that was the most devastating thing she'd heard since she'd arrived. And she'd heard several devastating things. A 4-year-old with a patchwork memory of his own mother built from whatever his brothers could manage on their better days. She kept her face composed. "He put her lavender bowl in his bed," Gideon said, "after it broke. I didn't tell him. He just went and collected the piece that was whole enough to hold and put it under his pillow." He said this like he'd just found it out, though she could see from his face that he'd known for a while and had been carrying it carefully. She didn't say anything. Some things you just let land. After a while, Gideon pushed the ledger back toward her side of the table. "If you have thoughts," he said, "about the account, what's manageable and what isn't, I'll hear them." "Not tonight," she said. "Tonight I don't know enough yet, but I'll think on it." He nodded, like that was an answer he could work with. She stood up to go and then stopped. There was something she'd been turning over since she came back from Aldis's, something adjacent to the account but not about money. "The boys," she said, "Thomas especially. When's the last time anyone asked him what he wants? Not what the ranch needs. What he wants." Gideon looked at her from the table. "I don't know," he said, honest enough that it sat in the room like something heavy. "That might be worth knowing," she said. She left him at the table with his coffee and went down the hall to Clara's room and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and thought about a man who had been failing at something he'd been attempting alone for 3 years and had asked for help in the only way he apparently knew how. 5 lines in a letter and a key sent to a stranger. She found Thomas the next morning before anyone else was up. He was at the corral in the gray pre-dawn light, checking the rigging on his saddle, which was what he always did before a day of cattle work. Systematic, thorough, the same order every time. She brought him a cup of coffee, the good coffee, and stood at the rail and handed it over the fence. He took it, looked at her sideways. "You're up early." "I'm always up early." "Earlier than usual." She leaned on the rail. "I looked at your father's ledger last night. He showed me." Thomas's hand stilled on the saddle strap. Just for a moment, then he went back to checking it. "He doesn't usually show anyone that." "I know." "What did you see in it?" She told him. Not everything. The mortgage figure she left alone because that was Gideon's to share on his own terms. But the shape of it, the cattle numbers, the hand situation, the account at Aldis's and what it would take to work it down at current rates of income. She watched his face as she talked and saw him absorbing things he'd half known and things he hadn't known at all. The particular expression of someone who has been operating on incomplete information and is recalculating in real time. When she stopped, he was quiet for a long moment. "How bad?" he asked. "Bad enough that it needs attention," she said. "Not so bad that it can't be worked." "What does that mean?" "It means the ranch is salvageable if the cattle operation can grow, which means you need more hands, which you can't afford, which means you need a different approach to the cattle." He looked at her. "You know cattle work?" "I know numbers," she said. "I don't know cattle the way you do. That's why I'm talking to you." He was still, processing. She could see the particular tension in him. The 19-year-old who had been running on instinct and exhaustion and stubbornness for 3 years, being offered an actual conversation about the thing he'd been managing alone. "There's a man north of here," Thomas said slowly. "Name of Pritchard. He runs a larger operation. Last fall he mentioned he needed summer grazing, said his own land couldn't sustain the full herd in summer. I didn't say anything to Pa because—" He stopped. "Because?" "Because it would mean Pritchard's cattle on our land. Some men take that as an obligation. Pa's particular about who uses our range. But the grazing fee would cover a month's account at Aldis's, maybe 6 weeks if Pritchard's numbers are what he said." Thomas looked at his hands on the saddle. "Maybe more." "Have you talked to your father about it?" "No." "Why not?" He didn't answer immediately. She waited. Outside the corral, the sky was going from gray to pale, and the horses were moving, awake and restless the way horses got in the early morning. "Because when I bring things to Pa," Thomas said, "he listens and then he makes a face like I've added to something that's already too heavy, and I'd rather not add to it." She heard what he was really saying. 3 years of watching his father buckle under weight he wouldn't let anyone share, and Thomas managing his own contributions around it. Not because he didn't have ideas, but because he'd learned that presenting ideas to Gideon felt like adding to the burden rather than dividing it. A system that guaranteed both of them stayed isolated from the one thing that might actually help. "Tell him about Pritchard," she said. "Tonight, at supper if you can." "He might say no." "He might," she said, "but he showed me the ledger. That's not nothing. Tell him." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. The morning was coming in properly now, the light going from pale to actual, the ranch emerging from the dark in its familiar state of held together and barely. The broken fence post she'd noted in the east corner, the barn door that needed new planking on the left side, the water trough that had a slow seep at the base, all of it fixable. None of it fixed yet. "You're different than I thought you'd be," Thomas said. "What did you think I'd be?" He almost smiled, just almost. Someone who'd try to make everything nice. He said nice the way a person said a word they had a complicated history with. Ma was nice. In a real way, not a put-on way. But Pa wrote for someone to run the household. I thought he'd get someone who'd come in and... He lifted one hand and let it fall. "Rearrange things." "I rearranged the kitchen shelves." "That's different." He picked up his coffee, which had gone slightly cold while they talked, and drank it anyway. "You didn't try to make us like you." "That wouldn't have worked," she said. "No," he said. "It wouldn't have." He finished the coffee and handed the cup back and swung up into the saddle. From up there he looked older than 19, or maybe just the right age for everything he'd been asked to do. "I'll talk to Pa," he said. "About Pritchard." "Good," she said. He turned the horse toward the range. She watched him go, this boy who had been acting like a man for 3 years because nobody else could, and thought about what Gideon had said the night before. "I thought I could keep everything the same." And about what it cost a family to be kept the same when the thing that had made it what it was already gone. She walked back to the house. Sam was up. She could hear him through the kitchen window, talking to himself with the narrative momentum of a small child who had a lot to say and didn't need an audience to say it. Henry would be down in 20 minutes, hungry and methodical. Eli and Jonah would follow, one of them disagreeable about something, the other pretending not to be bothered by the first one's disagreeableness. Gideon would come in last, from wherever he'd been since before dawn, and sit at his end of the table and be there and not quite there in the way he always was, the way of a man who had learned to be present in body and keep everything else behind a wall he'd built before he understood what it would cost him. She put the coffee on. She started the oats. She listened to the ranch wake up around her. Its sounds and its silences, its particular rhythms that were starting, slowly, to feel less foreign and more like the texture of a place she lived in. She was not happy exactly. She didn't think happiness was the right word for this, or not yet, but she was not unhappy. She was doing something that mattered to someone, which was not always the same as being happy, but was, in her experience, more sustainable. The key was still in her coat pocket. She touched it sometimes, for no reason she could have explained, just checking that it was there. The room at the end of the hall was still mostly closed to her. She slept in it, but she hadn't opened the curtains, hadn't looked at the things on the shelf above the chest of drawers, hadn't examined the framed sketch above the headboard that she'd been registering only as a shape in the dark for 2 weeks. She wasn't ready for that yet. She knew she'd have to be eventually, but there was an order to things, and she had learned to respect it. Outside, the day came on in the flat, relentless way it always did in Ash Hollow. Not beautiful, not dramatic, just present. The pale sky pressing down over the pale land, the wind moving through the dry grass in long, irregular waves. And in the kitchen of the Mercer ranch, the coffee heated and the oats thickened, and the smell of both moved through the house from room to room, reaching into corners and up through floorboards, doing what it had been doing for 2 weeks now, telling people something was there. Something was ready. Someone had stayed. Thomas talked to Gideon about Pritchard that same evening. Marian heard it happen. She was in the back room, the one with the replaced window pane that now let in afternoon light, mending Henry's boot sole with an awl and a length of waxed thread, which was painstaking work that required her full attention and kept her hands occupied while her ears did what they wanted. The voices from the front room were low enough that she couldn't catch every word, but she could catch the shape of the conversation. Thomas, careful and direct. Gideon, initially quiet in the way that meant he was deciding something. Then a longer exchange, back and forth. The particular rhythm of two people who don't talk easily trying to do it anyway because someone had finally made them understand it was necessary. She kept her eyes on the boot sole. The awl was old and the handle had worn smooth from years of use by hands that weren't hers. She'd found it in the bottom of the kitchen drawer where tools went to be forgotten. She wondered sometimes whose hands had used it before her, whether Clara had sat in this same back room doing the same work. And then she pushed the thought aside because that kind of wondering didn't do anyone any good. After about 20 minutes, the voices stopped. She heard a chair push back, then footsteps toward the desk in the corner, the roll top, the one with the ledger, and the specific sound of paper being moved around. Not searched for, just handled, like confirmation, or like a man double-checking something he'd already decided. She finished the boot and set it down and flexed her fingers. Her right hand ached from the awl. She'd been at it too long. She pressed her palm flat against her thigh for a moment and looked at the fixed window pane, at the last of the late afternoon light coming through it in that warm, amber-tinted way that she'd come to look forward to without meaning to. She came out of the back room and found Thomas in the hallway, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his head tipped back, looking at the ceiling in a way that was either exhaustion or relief, or possibly both occupying the same body at the same time. He looked like a man who had held his breath for a long time and was trying to remember how to stop. He looked at her when she came out. Something in his face had shifted, not dramatically, just enough. "He's going to send word to Pritchard," Thomas said. She nodded. "Good." He wasn't happy about it. Was he wrong about it? Thomas thought for a moment. "No," he said. He wasn't wrong. He pushed off the wall, straightened. He doesn't like needing things. "I've noticed," she said. Thomas looked at her for a moment. Not the appraising sideways look she'd gotten in the first week, but something more direct. More like the look of a person who has recalculated something and isn't going to announce the result, but knows it. "He said it was your idea," he said. "It was your idea. I just told you to say it out loud." "That's not nothing." "No," she said. "It's not." He went upstairs without further comment, which was the Thomas Mercer version of a great deal of feeling that he didn't have words for. She stood in the hallway for a moment after his boots hit the top step, listening to the house around her, the fire in the main room, the wind outside, the particular creak of the second stair that she'd stopped noticing and then started noticing again when she thought about how long it would take to learn all the sounds of a place until they felt like hers. She went to Clara's room. She stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame, and then, for the first time in 3 weeks of sleeping in it, she lit the lamp and carried it inside and actually looked at the room. No, it was not what she'd been afraid it would be. That was the first thing she understood, and the relief of it was more physical than she expected, something releasing in her chest, like a breath held too long. She'd been imagining, without letting herself imagine fully, a kind of shrine. A room kept exactly as it had been, everything preserved, the whole space heavy with grief made permanent. That was what happened in some houses. The dead got a room that the living walked past and never entered, where the air went stale and the windows stayed closed and the whole thing slowly became less a room and more an accusation. This wasn't that. It had been emptied, not stripped, but cleared in the particular way a room was cleared when someone was trying to make it habitable for another person without pretending nobody had been there before. The chest of drawers had Clara's things in the top 2 drawers. Marian had known that since the first morning, had not opened them and had not needed to. The curtains were Clara's, a faded blue cotton that let through light in a particular warm way she'd noticed even without opening them fully. The floor had a worn path from the door to the window, the specific track that 20 years of the same feet walking the same route left in wood. And above the headboard, the framed sketch she'd been registering as a shape in the dark every night for 3 weeks. She brought the lamp close and looked at it properly. It was a drawing of the ranch, not refined. Whoever had done it wasn't trained, but they were careful and specific. Every building accurate. The barn with its leftward lean, the house with its long porch, the corral fence in its right configuration, the hills behind. The juniper tree at the edge of the yard, which she recognized immediately because she'd been looking at it every morning from the kitchen window without knowing it was old enough to have been drawn 9 years ago. Done in pencil, the shading light in some places and heavy in others where the hand had pressed harder, reaching for something. In the bottom right corner, small and practical, CM 1873. Clara Mercer. 9 years ago. The ranch drawn from outside, looking in, by a woman who had lived in it for, Marian calculated, probably 15 years by that point. Maybe more. She had drawn her own home the way you drew something you were afraid of losing or something you wanted to see clearly. Or both. Usually both. Marian set the lamp on the chest of drawers and sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at the drawing for a long time. Long enough that the lamp flame steadied and the room went quiet around her and she could hear the night outside. The wind in the grass, the distant sound of one of the horses shifting in the corral, the faint creak of the house itself, settling. She thought about what Gideon had said in those careful, rationed words at the kitchen table 3 nights ago. She had a way of making things manageable. 20 years, 6 sons, a cattle ranch and a settlement that the rest of the world had largely decided wasn't worth the attention. What kind of person that required you to be, day after day, year after year, making things manageable not because it was easy, but because the alternative was letting them become unmanageable. And the people depending on you couldn't afford that. She had done that for a boarding house full of strangers once. 14 rooms, 20-some people rotating through over 4 years. A landlord who was alternately absent and demanding. A budget that required constant renegotiation with reality. She understood the work of it. The particular way it wore on a person, not in the dramatic ways that made good stories, but in the quiet ways that took something out of you, so gradually you didn't notice until you went looking for it one day and found it gone. She understood Clara Mercer in the way you understood someone you'd never met but had been living inside the shape of. The worn floor path, the faded curtains, the drawing above the bed, the boy who kept a piece of the lavender bowl under his pillow because that was the shape grief took when you were 4 and working with limited materials. She reached into her coat pocket and took out the iron key. She turned it over in her fingers. The metal was cold, the teeth worn slightly from age, the iron dull in the lamplight. She had carried it for 23 days, since the stagecoach, since the dust of Ash Hollow, since the moment she stepped down from the coach and understood that what she'd agreed to was larger and more difficult and more necessary than 5 lines in a letter had conveyed. She had carried it through the first supper and the broken bowl, and the conversation with Aldous at the counter and the fence at night, and every single morning she'd woken up in this room without looking at what was in it. She set it on the chest of drawers. Deliberately. The way you set something down when you've decided it doesn't need to be carried anymore. A key was for opening a door. Once you were through it, the key was just a key. She lay back on this bed and looked at the ceiling and thought that this was the most settled she had felt since she arrived. Not happy, not certain, not finished with the hard parts, just settled. Like a person who has stopped bracing for something and started simply being where they are. The Pritchard agreement came through 10 days later, carried by a hired boy on a fast gray horse who tied up at the post and waited in the yard with the particular patience of someone being paid by the hour and therefore unbothered by cold. Marian happened to be nearest the door when the knock came. Gideon was on the range and Thomas was with him, Caleb somewhere in the barn, the younger boys in the house, and useless for business matters on the best of days. She read the note on the porch with the cold coming off the range in flat, steady waves. Pritchard agreed to the summer grazing arrangement. The fee he quoted per head per month was higher than Thomas had estimated. She ran the numbers twice in her head to be sure. And yes, definitely higher, which meant the account at Aldis's could be addressed faster than she'd projected. She went inside, wrote a reply confirming the arrangement in the name of the Mercer Ranch, took it back out to the boy, and watched him ride off down the track toward the settlement. She stood on the porch for a moment afterward. The math moved through her head without being invited. The grazing fee against the outstanding account, the timeline, what was left after that, what it would take to rebuild the herd to the size the land could support, how long before the operation was generating enough that Thomas and Caleb weren't working 4 men's jobs between 2. It was not a short timeline. It was not hopeless either. She went inside and wrote it all down before she forgot any of it. That evening at supper, she told Gideon she'd confirmed the arrangement and showed him her calculation. He looked at the figures. He looked at her. Something moved across his face. Not quite irritation, not quite the opposite. The particular expression of a man who is recalibrating his understanding of what the person across the table from him was capable of. "You should have waited for me to reply," he said. Not angry, just stating it. The boy needed an answer. The numbers were right. I made a call. She met his eyes. If I was wrong about the numbers, tell me and I'll account for it. He looked at the figures again. You weren't wrong, he said. Then we're all right. He looked at her for one more beat, and she could see him deciding something about what kind of arrangement this actually was between them, what her role was, and what its edges were, and whether he could live with those edges. She held his gaze and let him decide. I'll take your word on the math, he said, finally. In the future. It was not a small concession from a man like Gideon Mercer, and she knew it, and she acknowledged it with a nod and nothing more, because making more of it would have embarrassed him. Thomas, across the table, studied his plate with an expression of contained satisfaction that he clearly hoped nobody was noticing. Jonah noticed and looked like he wanted to say something about it. Eli put his elbow into Jonah's ribs to stop him. Sam ate his supper with the focused dedication of someone who had no interest in adult business and significant interest in whether there would be cornbread. There was cornbread. There was always cornbread now. She'd figured out the ratios that worked with the particular quality of the cornmeal that Aldous carried, and she'd written it down so she wouldn't forget. March came in hard, which she should have expected because March in this part of the territory apparently did not believe in subtlety. The cold front pushed down from the north and kept the land locked in a gray, stubborn freeze that made outdoor work miserable and kept the boys closer to the house than any of them were fully comfortable with. 6 people who were used to spreading out across a ranch suddenly contained to a house-sized space, which had its own particular friction. She had seen this coming, and she had prepared for it the way she prepared for most foreseeable problems, by creating work that could absorb people. The soap-making took 3 days and occupied the kitchen in a way that naturally drew people in. The chemistry of it interested Henry more than she'd expected. He stood at her elbow on the first morning asking questions about the lie that were genuinely good questions, the kind you got from a child who observed things carefully before speaking, and she answered all of them straight without talking down to him, which seemed to be what he required. He stirred when she let him stir. He measured when she showed him how. By the end of the first batch, he was explaining the saponification process to Sam in terms that were largely accurate and completely incomprehensible to a 4-year-old, who listened with the polite attention of someone who understood nothing but respected the speaker's enthusiasm. Jonah appeared mid-morning of the second day and sat at the table and asked if he could learn to read a ledger properly. She looked at him over the soap pot. "Where's this coming from?" she asked. He shrugged with the elaborate casualness of a 13-year-old who had been thinking about something for a while and didn't want to admit it. "Thomas knows. Caleb's learning. I should probably know." "After supper," she said. "Bring the small ledger from the desk." He looked relieved in that quick way he had, the expression there and gone in a second. She turned back to the pot. She heard him take an apple from the bowl on the shelf. She kept fruit in that bowl whenever she could get it. It had become one of the quiet habits of the kitchen, the bowl being there, the bowl being stocked. And she heard him take a bite and then, under his breath, start to hum something. No recognizable tune, just a wandering, unself-conscious sound, the kind a person made when they forgot there was anyone to hear them. She let him hum. That evening after supper, she sat with him at the table for an hour, the small ledger open between them, going through what a debit was and what a credit was, and what the balance meant, and how to read the date columns, and what it meant when a number appeared in brackets. He was quicker than she'd expected, absorbing the logic of it fast, asking questions that showed he was genuinely tracking rather than just waiting for her to stop talking. By the end, he was working through entries on his own, running his finger down the column, calling out the balance. "That one's wrong," he said, pointing. She looked. He was right. An addition error from 3 months back, small but real. "Good catch," she said. He looked at the ledger with the focused pride of someone who has discovered they're better at something than they thought. "I can check the old ones," he said. "If there are more." "There might be," she said. "That would be useful." He looked up. He was trying very hard to appear merely practical about this. "I can do it tomorrow." "All right," she said. He closed the ledger carefully and went to bed, and she sat for a while at the table after he'd gone, thinking about a boy who talked too much and moved too fast and shoved his brother into a cabinet and whose grief came out sideways because he hadn't figured out any other direction for it, thinking about that boy staying up past dark to learn how to read an account ledger because he needed to understand that he could contribute something real, that he wasn't just the 4th son in a household that couldn't afford to pay attention to the 4th son, She understood, in that moment, something she'd been working toward without being able to name it. The problem in this house had never been that there wasn't enough love. The problem was that the love had gone underground 3 years ago, when Clara died and Gideon went inside himself and Thomas stepped up and took on a role too big for him, and everything else followed from those three things. The love was still there, in all of them, in every one of those boys and in their father, too. It had just been running out of ways to show itself. All she'd done, all she was doing, was give it somewhere to go. The table, the kitchen, the bowl of fruit, the hour with the ledger. These were not grand gestures. They were just consistent ones, and consistency, she had learned, was what people who had been badly frightened by loss needed more than anything else. They needed to believe that the thing in front of them was going to stay. The breach came from Gideon when she least expected it, on a night that had started like every other night. She had been closing up the kitchen, banking the fire properly, trimming the lamp, the last 20 minutes of the day that belonged to no task and therefore belonged to her. When she heard his boots on the porch and then the door, which no longer stuck since she and Gideon had fixed the hinge on the third night of her arrival. She had come to know his particular footstep the way you came to know all the sounds of a house you lived in, the specific weight and rhythm of it, the slight hesitation before entering a room that had other people in it. He did not go toward his end of the house. He came to the kitchen doorway and stopped. She looked up. He was still in his coat, cold off him, same as always this time of year. His face had something in it she couldn't immediately place. Not distress, not the careful blankness he used when he was managing something. Something more open than either of those, which on Gideon Mercer's face was enough to stop her in her tracks. "There's something I want to show you," he said. "If you're not too tired." She looked at him for a moment. "Now?" "It won't take long." She put her coat back on. He led her out the back of the house and across the yard, the cold coming in off the range in that flat, honest way it had. No wind tonight, just cold sitting still on everything. The stars were enormous. She had not fully adjusted to the sky out here, the way it asserted itself at night. All that darkness and all those stars pressing down without any competing light to diminish them. He walked around the east side of the barn to a stretch of fence line she'd walked past a dozen times without paying close attention to. He stopped at a section where 2 posts had been newly reset, the earth around them fresh and dark even in the starlight, tamped carefully, braced right. He'd replaced them himself. She could see the quality of the work. Clean, properly done, not rushed. "Henry helped," Gideon said. "Took us most of yesterday afternoon." She looked at the posts, then at him. "Henry helped you with fencing?" He asked to. Gideon's voice had something in it when he said it. Not quite pride, because pride implied showing off. And this was more private than that. It was the careful, barely handled feeling of a man who had been given something unexpected and wasn't sure yet what to do with it. "He's stronger than he looks." He worked the whole afternoon without complaining. She understood that she was not being shown a fence post. She was being shown what had happened beside a fence post. A 9-year-old boy who had been told he was the spare, the one too small to matter, who had spent a cold afternoon working beside his father, learning something real, being treated as if his presence and his effort meant something to the operation of this ranch and the people on it. "He asked me to teach him other things," Gideon said. He was looking at the posts, not at her. "I said I would." "Good," she said, and left it there, because more than that would have felt like she was assigning herself credit for something that belonged to the two of them, a father and a small boy in the cold, figuring out how to be in the same space together. They stood by the fence for a moment in the quiet. The dark was everywhere and the stars were pressing down, and there was nothing to hear except the faint movement of horses in the corral, which was a sound she had come to find oddly settling. "Marian." She looked at him. He was looking at her now. His face in the starlight was hard to read in detail, but she could see the general quality of what was in it, the way a person looked when they had decided to say something that had been forming for a long time and had finally arrived at the point where not saying it was the harder option. "I don't know how to do this well," he said. The words came out slowly, like he was finding each one separately. "Any of it, the house, the boys, the—" He stopped. His jaw tightened briefly, then released. "I didn't do it well before you came. I know that. And I'm not going to tell you I'm suddenly going to be different than I am, because I'm not a man who changes fast or shows things easily. And you've been here long enough to know that's not a temporary condition. She waited. But I'm asking you to stay, he said. Not because the house needs someone to run it, because... He stopped again, and she could see him working for the rest of it, the part that was harder. Because Thomas talked to me himself about Pritchard. Walked in and laid it out. He hasn't done that, brought me something of his own thinking in 2 years. And Henry's sleeping. Sam calls you by your name now instead of just standing next to you, which is what he does when he trusts someone. And Caleb... He let out a breath. Caleb came out of the barn last Tuesday and talked to me about a book. Out of nowhere, just stood there and told me what he'd been reading. We stood there for 10 minutes talking about it. Something in his voice shifted, almost imperceptibly. He hasn't done that since before Clara died. The name in the open air, not extracted, not preceded by hesitation or apology, just said the way you said someone's name when they were real to you and you'd stopped being afraid of how real they were. She kept her voice even. He's a reader. He just needed to believe someone wanted to know. I always wanted to know, Gideon said. I just didn't... He stopped. I stopped asking. After she went, I stopped asking them things. I thought if I kept things functioning, that was enough. Functioning isn't enough, she said. Not unkindly, just plainly. I know that now. He looked at the fence posts, at the fresh earth around them. I should have known it before. She thought about telling him that grief did things to a person's judgment, that 3 years of running on survival instinct would close off any person's ability to see what wasn't in front of them. She thought about saying all of that. Then she thought about what he actually needed right now, which was not to be understood and absolved, but to be answered. I'm not leaving, Gideon, she said. He looked at her. I didn't come here to leave, she said. I came because the work needed doing, and I was the person willing to do it, and those reasons haven't changed. And the boys are... She paused. I'm not leaving. He held her gaze for a long moment, and she could see him receiving it, the plainness of it, which was the language they both spoke best. No embellishment, no promise of more than what was there, just the bare fact of it, offered without conditions. Okay, he said, in the way he said the word when it carried everything else. They walked back. At the back door, he held it open for her, and she went through, and the warmth of the kitchen came up around her, and the fire she'd banked was still holding, and the lamp she'd trimmed was still burning, and the house was quiet in the particular way it was quiet now, which was different from the quiet it had been when she arrived, less like silence and more like rest. She opened Clara's curtains the next morning. She hadn't planned it. She just woke before light the way she always did, lay still for a moment listening to the house, and then got up and walked to the window and pulled them open. The sky was still dark at the edges, going to deep blue overhead, the land below it flat and dark, and just beginning to take its shapes back from the night. She stood with her fingertips on the cold glass. Behind her, she was aware of the drawing above the headboard, the ranch in pencil, the same view from a slightly different angle, done by a woman who had lived here and loved it and understood enough about loss to want to draw the things she was afraid of losing. She didn't turn around to look at it. She just stood at the window and looked at the actual version. The barn, the corral, the water trough, the east fence with its 2 new posts that had been set by a man and his 9-year-old son on a cold afternoon, which was a small thing that was also not a small thing. The juniper at the edge of the yard, standing exactly where it had been standing for decades, old enough to have been there when Clara drew it, old enough to have seen everything this ranch had been and lost and tried to become again. She kept her hands on the cold glass until the sky began to move from deep blue to the pale gray of approaching morning, and then she turned from the window and dressed and went to the kitchen. The letter from her sister arrived on a Saturday toward the end of March, brought back with the provisions by Thomas, who handed it to her without comment and went to deal with the horses. She read it at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside her. Her sister wrote the way she always had, practical and warm in alternating sentences, trying to cover several different feelings in the same amount of space most people used for one. She asked how Marian was settling. She mentioned the boarding house had closed and the building had been sold to a grain merchant, which Marian had expected and felt nothing about. She hoped the family was decent. She reported that their mother had asked about her, which meant their mother had actually said something kind for once, which meant either she was getting soft in her old age or something had frightened her. Near the end, she asked if you were happy. I didn't know what to tell her. I hope you have an answer by the time this finds you. Marian set the letter on the table. Outside the kitchen window, the ranch was mid-morning and operational. She could see Caleb crossing the yard with a purpose, Henry behind him with his rope, Sam running to catch up to Henry in the lurching, top-heavy run of a 4-year-old who had not yet worked out the relationship between enthusiasm and coordination. Somewhere further out, she could hear Thomas's voice calling something to the horses. The words not clear through the window, just the sound of a young man doing work he understood with a body that had been hardened to it. Gideon would be on the range. He was always on the range by this hour. He would come back at noon, eat, go back out. That was the rhythm. She knew his rhythms now the way she knew the creak on the third stair, the way she knew what it meant when the kitchen fire burned low on one side versus the other, what it meant when the wind came from the north versus from the west. She thought about the question her mother had sent across all that distance. Is she happy? She thought about what honest meant when applied to that question. She was not the kind of happy that came from ease. She had never trusted that kind. It had always felt to her like weather, pleasant while it lasted and then gone, leaving you no different than before. She was not happy the way people were happy when things had gone according to plan, because nothing about this had gone according to any plan she'd made, because she hadn't made much of a plan. She'd gotten on a stagecoach with one trunk and an iron key and walked into someone else's difficulty, because difficulty was something she knew how to be inside of. But she had opened the curtains in Clara's room that morning and stood at the window watching the ranch wake up, and the watching had felt like something she had a right to do. Not like a guest watching, not like a stranger watching, but like a person who lived somewhere watching the place they lived. And there was a bowl of fruit on the kitchen shelf that she restocked whenever she could, because she had noticed that the boys reached for it in passing, absently, the way you reached for things in a place that was yours. And there was a 9-year-old who had stopped calling himself the spare. And there was a 4-year-old who pressed against her knee while she worked, and who had put the broken piece of his mother's lavender bowl under his pillow, not because he'd forgotten about Marian, but because grief and love were not a competition, even at 4 years old, even with limited materials. And there was a man who had stood at a fence in the cold and said, "I'm asking you to stay," because it was the most honest thing he knew how to say, and for whom honesty had always been worth more than anything easier. Was she happy? She turned the question over and looked at the underside of it. She was where she was supposed to be. She was doing work that mattered to real people in real and visible ways, and she could see the effects of it, which was more than she'd been able to say in Danforth. She was not lonely in the deep way she had been lonely at the end, managing a building full of strangers who came and went and never quite saw her. She was tired in the productive way, not the hollow way. She was challenged and sometimes frustrated and sometimes genuinely uncertain about how to navigate the next difficult thing. She was, in some ways she hadn't expected, less alone than she had been in a long time. That wasn't the same as happy, but it was, she thought, more durable. She found a piece of paper and a pen and she wrote back to her sister, "Tell Mother I'm all right. I'm working hard and the work matters. There are 6 boys and a man who needed someone to stay, and I'm staying. I don't know if that's happiness, but I think it might be something better. I'll write more when the cold breaks." She addressed it and set it out for Thomas and finished her cold coffee and stood up. Sam appeared in the kitchen doorway with mud on both knees and the expression of someone who had been doing something inadvisable and was now calculating how visible the evidence was. He looked at Marian. She looked at him. She looked at the knees. "What happened?" she said. Not a question, because with Sam it was rarely useful to frame it as one. "I found a good mud," he said, which was not an explanation, but was, she had come to understand, Sam's particular way of communicating that he considered the cost worth it. She put the letter in her pocket, went to the shelf for the cloth, and crouched down in front of him. He held still while she cleaned his knees with the focused patience of someone who had accepted this as a recurring feature of his existence, which, she reflected, it was. "Is it still good mud?" she asked. He considered. "Yes," he said. "Very good. Then don't go back in it today." "Okay," he said, in the tone of someone who was not promising anything. She stood. She folded the cloth. She put it back. And Sam stood in the kitchen doorway with his cleaned knees and watched her move around the kitchen the way he always watched her, gravitational and trusting and entirely unself-conscious about it, the way small children watched people they had decided belonged to them. She had not asked for this. She had not known, when she stepped off that stagecoach into the dust of Ash Hollow, that a 4-year-old boy with no memory of his mother would become the clearest measure of whether she was doing something right. That every time he pressed against her knee or called her name or showed her a good mud, it would register somewhere in her as something she did not have words for but knew the feel of. She started on the midday meal. Sam climbed onto his stool in the corner and kept her company, talking about the mud, and then about something Henry had shown him with a rope, and then about something Jonah had said that morning that had apparently been very funny, though the retelling lost the shape of it somewhere. She listened and responded and kept her hands moving, and outside the kitchen window the ranch went on doing what it did. The horses, the cold, the flat pale sky, the fence lines stretching away toward the hills. The iron key stayed on the chest of drawers. She stopped seeing it as a key after a while and started seeing it as simply a thing that was there, part of the surface of the room, part of the texture of the place she was living. The way certain things became part of a room's character once they'd been in it long enough. The curtains in Clara's room were open every morning now. The view from the window had become her first sight of the day. The barn, the corral, the juniper, the east fence with its new posts. She had learned all the things you learned about a place over time, which floorboard to step over in the hallway to avoid waking Sam, how far to bank the kitchen fire at night to have it catch fast in the morning, which of the horses was easiest and which required patience, how to read the sky in the early morning to know what the afternoon's weather was going to do. The ranch was still in debt. The fence still needed work in the south section. Eli still had bad mornings and better afternoons, and the occasional evening where he'd say something sharp and then look immediately sorry for it without knowing how to apologize cleanly. Thomas still worked too hard and refused help until he'd exhausted himself. Gideon was still a man who kept the interior of himself carefully maintained and accessible only at specific angles and in specific light. None of that had been fixed. She had not come to fix it. She had come because something needed doing, and what needed doing was not a repair, but a presence. Someone staying, someone whose first question in the morning was not whether it was worth the effort, but what needed doing next. Someone who kept the fruit bowl stocked and the fire going, and who sat with a 9-year-old on a porch step and said, without equivocation, that being called a spare part was someone else's stupidity and not a fact worth organizing your life around. Small things, repeated, without drama. That was what the Mercer ranch had needed, and that was what she had given it, and that was what she would continue to give it, not because she was selfless or saintly or free from doubt. She was none of those things. She had plenty of doubt. She had nights where she lay in Clara's room and wondered if she'd underestimated what she'd walked into. But because she had walked through the door and the key was on the chest of drawers, and she was not a person who walked back out of things she'd decided to be inside of. She stood at the kitchen window on a late March morning, the cold still holding but something in it slightly softer than it had been, the specific quality of almost spring, not arrived yet but credible. And she looked at the ranch, the boys working, the horses, the fence, the barn, the juniper, the hills behind everything, pale and indifferent and unchanged. Gideon came around the corner of the barn leading a horse, and she watched him for a moment without his knowing. He moved the way he always moved, deliberate, unhurried, carrying the weight of what he was responsible for in his body, the way men who had been at it long enough did. He said something to the horse, which she couldn't hear through the glass. He said it again. The horse settled. He looked up at the house then, not at the kitchen window specifically, just at the house, the way you looked at a place you were coming back to. Something in his face when he did, she caught it at this distance, just barely, was different from what she'd seen on the first night when he walked in from the range and found her standing at his stove. That night his face had been the face of a man expecting nothing and having nowhere particular to arrive to. This morning, looking at the house from the yard, there was something in it that had not been there before. He went to the barn. She turned back to the stove. She was not into certainty. There was no certainty out here, and there never had been. There was land that required more from people than they sometimes had, and weather that didn't negotiate, and debt that needed working down, and boys that needed more than any one person could efficiently provide, and a man who was slowly, painfully, imperfectly learning how to let his walls do something other than hold everything at a distance. There was work. There was always more work. She stirred the pot. She listened to the house around her. She heard Sam on the stairs, the sound of his particular scramble. She heard Henry's flat-footed step behind him. She heard from somewhere above Caleb's door and then his footsteps, and then his voice saying something to one of the younger ones that she couldn't make out, but that didn't have friction in it. Ash Hollow was not a place that forgave much or offered more than it had. It took everything you gave it and asked for more and did not say thank you. That was simply what places like this were. But inside the house at the end of the flats, something was moving that had not been moving before she came. Not salvation, not transformation, nothing as clean or as complete as either of those words implied. Just the slow, difficult, absolutely ordinary work of people learning to trust that the person across the table was going to be there tomorrow. And the day after that, and the day after that, Marian Vale had arrived with one trunk and an iron key. The trunk was mostly unpacked now. The key was on the chest of drawers. She was still here. She intended to stay. Outside, Ash Hollow held still under a pale sky that was, if you looked at it long enough and without expecting anything, not entirely without beauty. And inside the kitchen of the Mercer ranch, the fire was going, and the pot was on, and the fruit bowl on the shelf was full, and the day was beginning the way days had been beginning in this house for the last 3 weeks, with the smell of something cooking moving through the rooms from wall to wall, telling everyone who lived here the same quiet, unremarkable, absolutely necessary thing. Someone is here, something is ready, come to the table.